Hello, my name is Justin Haskins. Welcome to the show. Today, we're going to be talking about something a little bit different. If you've been following the show for a while, it's still in its infancy, as many of you know. But if you've been following the show for a while, you know that the channel is pretty much dedicated to talking about public policy. That's mostly what we deal with: current events, public policy, especially the stories that they aren't talking about elsewhere. If you're interested in hearing about that information, then please subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment. All of the stuff's going to help break through those big tech algorithms. But today's topic is not about those things. Today's topic is about something more important than those things. Today, we're going to be talking about faith. We're going to be talking about historical evidence for the claims of Christianity. This is not something that I have done many times in my career. In fact, I've done very little of it. And in some ways, I was reluctant to do this video, not because I'm ashamed of my beliefs. I am a Christian, and I've been very open about my Christian faith in front of millions of people when I've done radio interviews and TV and stuff like that, when it's come up. But because I've always been afraid that if I talk about the evidence, the things that I actually believe, the reasons why I believe the Christian faith, that maybe people wouldn't find my arguments persuasive, and maybe that would lead people away from investigating the question further. There are probably people out there who are better at this than I am. And for that reason, I've been very reluctant to lay out the evidence in detail, just out of fear that I may not do a very good job. And well, what does that mean about me and my faith? And what does that mean for other people in their faith? Am I going to cause other people to stumble? That's just not something that I wanted to do. But I've been feeling lately more and more like it's really important to talk about this issue. So on the channel, we're going to be doing some faith-based, historical, history-focused, especially as it pertains to religious ideas and things like that, videos. It's going to be under a playlist called God and Liberty. And sometime we're going to talk about how faith and Judeo-Christian beliefs in particular played a really essential role in the founding of America and in understanding of individual liberty and those kinds of things. But this video is very much focused only on faith and historical evidence for Jesus. Before I get into that, I just want to say that I didn't grow up a Christian. I grew up sort of, I guess what you could say, is a deist. I believed in God. I would pray to God, but I didn't believe that Jesus was God. I didn't believe that the claims of the Bible were true for the most part. At best, I thought maybe Jesus was a prophet or something, but I just thought that the historical evidence for Jesus was lacking. Not because I actually took the time to investigate it, but because it just seemed that way on the surface. I never really took the time to dive into the history itself to discover the truth. Now, once I did do that, in my early 20s, I very quickly became a Christian. And for me, it was very much, it wasn't driven by sort of a personal crisis. It wasn't driven by me trying to find myself. I wasn't a drug addict or something that turned to Jesus in a moment of desperation. There's nothing wrong with any of that, by the way. I'm just saying that wasn't my story. My story was very much an intellectual pursuit that turned into something much more than that. But it started as just an intellectual interest. I was being challenged to study the historical reliability of the Gospels. I was being challenged to study the historical claims of Christianity. And as I started looking into it, I became convinced that they were likely true. And I want to share some of those evidences with you. If you're watching this video and you're planning on using this you're a believer and you're planning on using this to talk to a person who is not a believer, I hope you find this information useful. I really do. I think that these evidences that I'm going to present to you, some of them are more persuasive than others. Some people will find them persuasive. Other people will find them not persuasive at all. I know at least one person will find them persuasive, and that person is me. So I think that there's got to be somebody else out there who's like me and will find some of this stuff persuasive. If you're not a believer, please know that I understand, and that, you know, I don't have a triumphalist sort of attitude about my faith. Um, there are brilliant people who never come to believe in the central claims of Christianity. Brilliant people. And I think that Christians who talk about others as non-believing people as though they're morons, or as though they are, you know, just ignorant people unwilling to see the truth. I just don't think that that is in any way helpful or reflective of reality. Um, and I also understand that you may watch this video and you may, as a non-believer, kind of scoff at it, and maybe you think, nah, I don't buy it. You know, nice try. Didn't really think it was persuasive. That's okay. All that I'm asking that you do is that you keep an open mind, and that you really use this, hopefully, as a starting point for further research, further thought, and maybe even prayer, to think about the things that are being discussed here, because I actually think the evidence for Christianity is very, very strong. And that's what I hope to show you throughout this video. Christianity is not some crazy backwoods idea invented by, you know, Bible thumping rednecks in the year 1920. This is something that has existed for 2,000 years. And some of the most intelligent people in all of world history were Christians, from kings and emperors to philosophers and academics and scientists. Many of the most famous people you've ever heard of believed that there was really strong historical evidence for Jesus. And so it isn't a stupid idea. And I hope that this video helps to, at the very least, show you, if you are not a believer, that. And at most, I hope that it provides a stepping stone for you to look into to these claims further, and perhaps to other claims as well. Maybe someday you'll find yourself asking some of the really tough questions that I had to ask myself after doing those, doing a lot of research on these questions. The other thing I want to say before I get into the actual proofs are historical evidences, is that all I'm trying to do in this video is show that there is really strong historical evidence that the central teachings of Christianity have been around for 2,000 years, that those central teachings are supported well by historical evidence, using normal methods for determining whether something is historically reliable or historically true. That if you use those normal tools for a historical analysis, you will find that Christianity, the central claims of Christianity, pass all those tests. I'm not trying to make the argument that every single sentence of the Bible is the word of God. I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying that's not what I'm trying to do. And I'm not trying to make the argument that every single thing in the Bible needs to be taken literally or anything like that. These are not the arguments that I'm discussing. I'm just talking about the central claims of Christianity and whether there's good historical evidence to support them. Okay, now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, let's start in on the 5 claims. Now, I was going to present this information to you by sort of reading a script almost, which is not something that I normally do. And then, reading a script and then kind of ad-libbing from that, and then providing you with cut shots to various things. But I've decided I'm just going to walk you through my own notes, my own evidences as I wrote them down. And then that way I can show you some of the direct quotes themselves, and you can see the text themselves. We're not going to go over every single thing that are in my notes because I just don't think we're going to have time to do that. But I did want to show you some of the quotes word for word as we go through them. And since I have them in my notes, I think that's the best way to do that. So let's pull up the notes right here. We're going to scroll up to the top. All right. So the first historical proof, the first piece of evidence that I want to present is that there are literally thousands of ancient copies of the New Testament. The New Testament is the part of the Bible that tells the story of Jesus from the time he was conceived and then born, his early childhood, into his adult life, his ministry, his death, his resurrection, the meaning of his resurrection, his ascension into heaven, the early days of the church. All of this stuff is captured in the New Testament. The New Testament is not one singular book. The New Testament is really not even a book. We talk about books in the Bible, but for the most part, I like to think of them as really they're letters, they're a collection of historical accounts. Depends on what specifically you're talking about. Sometimes they're poetry, sometimes they're meant to be read as narrative history, sometimes they're allegorical. But the New Testament in particular is predominantly letters and historical descriptions of alleged events that occurred. And they are written, for the most part, by either people who were eyewitnesses of Jesus or people who knew eyewitnesses of Jesus. At least that's what most scholars believe about most of the New Testament. There's going to be some examples where that isn't necessarily the case, but for the most part, that's what you need to know. The New Testament, whether everything in the New Testament was written by the people who we think may have written them, or they were written by other people, the point is they were written by many people. They're very, very old, very, very ancient, and they allege to be the fruit of eyewitness accounts and people talking to others who had eyewitness accounts, and actual letters written by eyewitnesses and people who knew eyewitnesses that claim to see these events related to Jesus. Okay. So these are historical testimonies. Christianity is a religion built on eyewitness testimonies and evidences. This isn't some skeptical thing or direct divine revelation from God in the New Testament. Most of what we see in the New Testament is, I saw this thing happen. Jesus did this miracle. Jesus said this thing. Or the apostle Paul said this thing, or the apostle Peter did this thing, or went to this place. They're meant to be read more like a history book, although they're not written in the same way that a modern history book would be written, but they're meant to be thought of closer to that in much of the New Testament than sort of like this direct divine revelation given to some person and then they jot it down, which is something that you might see in some other religions. That's not really what the New Testament is meant to be for the most part. Now, there are parts of the New Testament that are literally letters written by early church leaders who knew Jesus or who saw Jesus resurrected or things like that to other people in other parts of the world talking about theological matters. And that is really strong evidence too, because again, we're talking about lots of different writers, lots of different ways of writing. Some of it is historical accounts. Some of it are ancient letters to churches. But it's not one author. It's not one gigantic book or set of books. It's many authors writing many different ways, all claiming something to be historically true. All right. In the same way that you would have writers talking about other historical events in the ancient world, claiming those events are true. Okay. So, because we're dealing with ancient historical documents, one of the key things that we would want to see in a reliable historical record is lots and lots of copies, lots and lots of evidences, all alleging the same thing or something close to the same thing. And that is exactly what we see from the historical record with the New Testament. There are literally thousands of ancient copies of the New Testament. Thousands of ancient copies. Historian Gary Habermas, this is a direct quote from him. He's been studying this his entire life. He is an expert in the field. Nobody knows this stuff better than Gary Habermas. And he says this: in light of these criteria, he's talking about historical reliability of ancient sources, the New Testament is the best attested work from the ancient world. The best attested work from the ancient world. First, it has by far the greatest number of existing manuscripts. Ancient classical works are attested to by very few full or partial manuscripts, usually less than 10. In comparison, over 5,000 full or partial Greek manuscripts of the New Testament exist. Thousands of additional texts exist in other languages, especially Latin. This overwhelming number of copies yields a much stronger base for establishing the original text. Okay, some scholars will say, yes, that's true. There's no doubt about it. Thousands and thousands and thousands of historical copies of the New Testament exist, but there are differences in these copies. There are thousands and thousands of differences. They call those differences variances between these texts. So yes, we've got lots of copies of these ancient documents that go back a very long time, but they don't all perfectly line up. So how can we know that they're reliable if they don't perfectly line up? You'll see people like Bart Ehrman, a very famous skeptic professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is a beautiful place, by the way, although crazy, crazy liberal, but it's a beautiful place in Chapel Hill. I like it a lot. He points out that there are hundreds of thousands of variants between the thousands of copies of the New Testament that exist. So how do we know that those are true? Well, this is a really important point. Although there are thousands of variances, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of variances between the thousands of copies of the documents that we have, that same thing would be true relative to the number of copies that are available for a whole bunch of other historical ancient texts that we all basically universally accept as being historically reliable. That's number one. Number two is that most of those variants, the vast, vast, vast majority of the variants are just grammatical differences, spelling differences, things that you got to remember. This is in the ancient world. We're not copying things using, modern technology. We're talking hand copying things. We're talking about oral transmission of records, right? People just handing it down from one person to another by telling them the story over and over and over again. And then people writing that down and copying that being written down. Little errors are going to creep in when you have that. But the overarching main beliefs about Christianity remain the same in all of these different documents. Okay. You do have some documents like Gnostic documents. If you look up Gnostic gospels and things like that, you'll find all kinds of different things that claim sort of a different version of the Jesus story. But there is no evidence that anybody in the early Christian church accepted those documents as being historically reliable. Basically, everybody in the early church, for the most part, believed that they were not reliable. All right. So the main thrust of the Christian faith, the main tenets of Christianity, who Jesus is, why Jesus came, whether Jesus is God or not, the reliability of Scripture, whether there's one God or many gods, whether that one God is the same God of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible or it's something else. All of these things are the same in all of these thousands of historical documents, these copies of these historical documents that exist from the ancient world. All right. There is a really, really powerful thing that Gary Habermas talks about as well that I want to mention. The gap of time that exists between the earliest copies that we have and the actual events occurring relative to other ancient documents that we have is very, very small. Normally in the ancient world, you have hundreds and hundreds or even 1,000 years of a gap from the time that an event supposedly happened and the historical document that is talking about this event occurring. But in the case of Christianity, we have copies that are much closer in time to the actual events than what you normally have for ancient historical evidence. So Gary Habermas says this: concerning the date between the original writing and the earliest copies, ancient classical works generally exhibit gaps of at least 700 years. The interval significantly lengthens to twice this amount or longer with certain works by a number of key writers such as Plato and Aristotle. Do you ever hear anybody talk about whether Plato or Aristotle are reliable, so whether what we have is really what Plato wrote or really what Aristotle wrote. People don't talk about that, right? We just believe that it's historically reliable, even though the evidence for that is much less than the evidence what we have for Jesus, for the stories about Jesus. In contrast, Habermas continues, the Bodmer and Chester Beatty papyri contain most of the New Testament, dating to about 100 to 150 years later than the New Testament, using an approximate date of AD 100 for its completion. The Codex Sinaiticus is a complete copy of the New Testament, while the Codex Vaticanus is a nearly complete manuscript, both dating roughly 250 years after the originals. These small gaps help to ensure the accuracy of the New Testament text. So relative to other ancient historical documents, if we're going to use normal historical standards for determining whether a story is historically true or reliable, the Bible, the New Testament Bible, beats out everything in the ancient world by far. It's not even close. Okay? Not even close. Habermas says, further, significant portions of some ancient works are missing. For example, 107 of Livy's 142 books of Roman history have been lost. Of Tacitus's original histories and annals, only approximately half remain, right? That's not the case with the Bible. We've got all the books of the Bible. We have really old versions of the Bible going back 2,000 years. It really is amazing. Now, one of the things that Habermas cites in one of the articles that he wrote, I believe, it might have been a book, I can't remember. One of the things that Habermas wrote is he cites Helmut Koester, who is a famous scholar from Harvard. This is not an Orthodox, Bible-thumping, evangelical Christian guy. This is a non-Orthodox scholar from Harvard. I believe he's passed away now, but he worked at Harvard for many years, and he wrote this. Classical authors, meaning ancient authors from the ancient world, are often represented by but one surviving manuscript. If there are half a dozen or more, one can speak of a rather advantageous situation for reconstructing the text. In other words, historians believe that if you have a half a dozen or more of copies of some ancient writer's text, that generally we can say that that's likely to be reliable. But there are nearly 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek. The only surviving manuscripts of classical authors often come from the Middle Ages, but the manuscript tradition of the New Testament begins as early as the end of 2 CE. I believe he means the second century Common Era, 2nd century AD. It is therefore separated by only a century or so from the time at which the autographs were written. Much of the New Testament was not written at the time of at 1 AD. When Jesus was born. Most of these things were being written at 100 AD or 80 AD or 60 AD or something like that. So what he's saying here is that the gap, the same argument Habermas was making before, the gap between when the document was written and when we have the copy of the original document is not a big gap at all by normal historical standards. So he says, as early as 2 CE, it is therefore separated by only a century or so from the time at which the autographs were written. Thus, it seems that the New Testament textual criticism possesses a base which is far more advantageous than that for the textual criticism of classical authors. So if you're just going to base it on the evidence that we have using normal historical tools for assessing whether something is likely to be true, we have really, really, really strong evidence for the case, for the reliability of the New Testament documents, just based on how many they are, the gap between the originals and the copies that we have, the huge, massive number of copies, the fact that they're copied in lots of different languages, but they all basically say the same thing. We have lots and lots of evidence to believe that at the very least, the main arguments of the New Testament are really, really, really old. They go back 2,000 years. Okay, people actually believe them. That doesn't mean that those things are necessarily true, but it does mean that people believed it 2,000 years ago. All right, and that's one of the really key essential arguments that I'm going to make. Okay, let's go to argument number 2. All right, this is fact number 2, proof number 2, evidence number 2. There are numerous non-Christian ancient writers who acknowledge that Jesus was a real historical person. And in some cases, they even admit that he reportedly performed miracles and was treated as a key religious figure. So a lot of people have never heard this before in their lives. They've never heard this, but there are close to 20 non-Christian ancient writings about Jesus. So we're not even talking about the thousands of manuscripts that I mentioned before that talk about that are recording the New Testament tradition, or Old Testament texts or anything like that. We're talking about 20 non-Christian ancient writings, non-biblical writings that are non-Christian writings that are talking about Jesus. And some of these are dated to as few as 20 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Others are dated to closer to 150 years afterwards, which by historical ancient standards is not that much. Among the numerous ancient authors are highly respected writers and officials such as Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny the Elder, and even some national rulers such as Trajan. All right. Now, there's a ton of examples that I could give you that would provide you with this. I could go through all 20 of them, but we don't have time to do that. So if you want to do just a really basic search, I would recommend searching in just Google or something like that for Tacitus Jesus or some other ancient writer, and you're going to find lots and lots and lots of results. The quote that I want to give you, because I am going to give you a quote, see what we're talking about here. This comes from Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews. So Josephus was this prominent Jewish historian. He's not a Christian. He never converts to Christianity, as far as I'm aware. He lived and wrote in the 1st century AD. So this would be within 100 years of the birth of Jesus. That means that he lived at the same time as the apostles and the early writers of the New Testament. Okay? In Antiquities, in his book Antiquities, Josephus writes this: having such a character, he's talking about rash and daring, and not Ananus thought that with Festus dead and Albinus still on the way, he would have the proper opportunity. Convening the judges of the Sanhedrin, this is the Jewish Senate, he brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, whose name was James, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. But those of the city residents who were deemed the most fair-minded and who were strict in observing the law were offended at this. In an earlier section of Antiquities, Josephus provides a really stunning description of Jesus, a different one. About this time lived Jesus, he says, Josephus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was the achiever of extraordinary deeds and was a teacher of those who accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When he was indicted by the principal men among us, and Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him originally did not cease to do so, for he appeared to them on the 3rd day, restored to life, as the prophets of the deity had foretold these, and countless other marvelous things about him, and the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. Now I wrote this in my notes, and this is absolutely true. The text sounds too incredible to be true, right? This is written by a non-Christian saying things that kind of sound Christian. And so there are a lot of modern scholars who say that Christians later added or altered Josephus's original description to make it sound as though he were a Christian. And this could be true, but even if it is the case that Christians altered it later on to try to make it sound more in line with Orthodox Christian teachings, scholars pretty much generally, universally agree that because most of the known manuscripts of Josephus, including all of the earliest ones, use this version of the text, and because Josephus references Jesus elsewhere in his writings, it's likely that at least some of this description of Jesus goes all the way back to Josephus himself. So even if some of the more exaggerated claims about Jesus in this text was put into the text by writers later on, just trying to mess with it to make it sound more Christian, it's still the universal belief from scholars is that there are enough copies of Josephus's writings and enough versions of the writings that mention Jesus and mention at least some of this story in a way that doesn't necessarily mentions at least some of the story, that it has to be true, or it's very likely that it does come from just Josephus himself. Not every part of it, maybe, but enough of it that he attests to this person named Jesus who lived during this time and did these things and had a following and that sort of thing. So this is a non-Christian who is clearly indicating that there were people who, at the time that he was writing, way back in the first 100 years of Christianity, believed that Jesus is divine. And believe that Jesus really did exist and really did all these amazing things, and that some people believe that he was a Messiah. So what these things very clearly show, what these sources and many of the other sources, not just Josephus, but things that Tacitus and other people said, what they really clearly, strongly show is that during the time that these ancient non-Christian writers were alive, they had heard about Jesus. That's number one. Number two, knew that he was an important religious figure. Number three, acknowledged that he had many followers long after his death. And number four, that those followers existed all over the world and believed in religious claims about Jesus, not merely social or cultural claims about Jesus. Okay? This is what the non-Christian historical record indicates. It shows that lots of people believed that Jesus was the Messiah, that lots of people held Jesus in this extremely high regard, that there are sources that show that people believe that Jesus was capable of doing miracles and other things, and that these are all coming from records, coming from people, writers, ancient writers that we trust to be generally reliable, and who were not Christian and had no reason to make up the story because they weren't Christian. So this doesn't show that Jesus is God. It doesn't show every central claim of the Christian religion is true, but it does help illustrate that Christianity is an ancient religion. And I think that that's a really, really important thing to understand. So we have lots and lots of thousands of records from the early Christian church in that helps to bolster the validity and reliability of the New Testament documents themselves as historical records. These are eyewitness accounts. We have thousands of them. The gaps between the copies that we have, the most ancient copies that we have, and the original that were written down that we don't have anymore is relatively small by ancient records. We have non-Christian writers, 20 of them from the ancient world, 20 ancient writings from non-Christian writers saying things about Jesus, basically verifying that this person really did exist, that he'd done miracles, that he had lots of followers, that people believed that he was the Messiah, and other things like that. All right. That's a lot of evidence just in and of itself right there. The idea that this is some later innovation created hundreds and hundreds of years later, invented by people in Europe or something, is completely fictional. There's no reason to believe that that's the case. This brings us to argument number three. Argument number three, historical proof number three. Dozens of Christian writers from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries confirm that the basic beliefs of Christianity were widespread and adopted soon after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Just one second. I've been talking for a while already, and I need some water. Okay, so evidence number three is mainly focused on Christian writers. So now we're talking about people who profess to be Christians. We're talking about people from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. So we're going into the 100s and 200s and things like that, although you see this later on as well, who say that there were lots of people around at that time who believed the fundamental truths and teachings about Jesus. It was a widely held belief amongst a variety of different communities all over the world, in Palestine and in Rome and in North Africa and in modern day Turkey and all over the ancient world. There were people who believed in the central fundamental teachings of Jesus. And many of those communities had some interaction with people who were eyewitnesses themselves, and they had access to original letters written by people who claimed to have seen Jesus. They actually had met some of these people and other things like that. All right. So this is non-biblical evidence. Yes, these are Christians, but these are not biblical writers. This is not stuff that's in the Bible. This is separate from that. So in addition to the Bible itself and the New Testament writings, which are eyewitness accounts, and the non-Christian writings that we have from people like Tacitus and Josephus, we also have early Christian writings, all right, from people like Justin Martyr and Polycarp, and Irenaeus is another one of my favorite writers from that period, and Ignatius, and there's a whole bunch of others, okay? And we're going to get into some of those quotes in a second. The point is, there are lots of additional writings that we have that are extra biblical, not in the Bible, non-biblical writings that are eyewitness testimony that the Christian faith was widely believed by lots of people, including people who had access to eyewitnesses, including communities that actually saw Jesus. All right. So, as I point out in my notes, which you might be able to see on the screen here if you're watching the YouTube version, it's one of the least talked about historical evidences for Christianity. There are dozens of writings from the early church that indicate that the fundamental beliefs of Christianity had been accepted by communities located all over the world in the 1st and 2nd centuries. In many cases, the writers specifically mentioned that they had known apostles, other Jesus eyewitnesses or eyewitnesses to the apostles. So we're talking about groups of people who believed, who were had access to the best historical evidence of the period, and they believed this story to be true. This proves beyond any doubt whatsoever that Christianity really is an ancient religion that dates to the time of Jesus. It doesn't mean that it's true necessarily. It just means that, but it does necessarily mean that there is no denying that it's an ancient belief, that it's not a later innovation. Okay. And it proves beyond any doubt that it's a religion built on testimonies of people who claim to see miraculous things from the apostles, the emissaries of Jesus, the followers of Jesus who went out into the world and supposedly were capable of doing miracles themselves, but also in some cases from the actual eyewitnesses of people who saw Jesus. These communities had access to that information. They had access to their writings, and they believed these things deeply. One of the examples is Polycarp, who is a Christian bishop in Smyrna, which is located in modern-day Turkey. He wrote at the end of the 1st century or early 2nd century, so we're talking about around the time of the apostles, just after a lot of the apostles had died. Wherefore, gird up your loins and serve God in fear and truth. This is Polycarp writing. Forsaking the vain and empty talking and the error of the many, for that ye have believed on him, and that raised our Lord Jesus Christ from the dead, and gave unto him glory and a throne on his right hand, unto whom all things were made subject that are in heaven and that are on earth, to whom every creature that hath breathed doth service, who cometh as judge of quick and dead, whose blood God will require of them that are disobedient unto him. Now he that raised him from the dead will raise us also, if we do his will and walk in his commandments and love the things that he loved, abstaining from all unrighteousness, covetousness, love of money, evil speaking, false witness, not rendering evil for evil, or railing for railing, or blow for blow, or cursing for cursing. Okay, what am I trying to show here? What I'm trying to show is that you have non-biblical writers in the early 2000, almost 2000 years ago, 1900 years ago, writing about fundamental teachings of Christianity, acknowledging that Jesus is God, talking about people following Jesus, talking about everlasting life. The basic fundamental teachings of Jesus is recorded in documents that are not in the Bible, written 2000 years ago. And often by people, in the case of Polycarp, this is one of those situations, who ended up getting murdered for his belief. All right. So Polycarp, I can't stress this enough. He's a really, really good early source, because this isn't, he's not just some random guy who was writing 2000 years ago. He's highly educated, highly respected, died for his beliefs, believed it so strongly that he was willing to die for it, claimed to actually have met some of the apostles. He knew John the Apostle. He knew other really famous, influential church fathers. There's really good reasons to believe that Polycarp is, at the very least, reflecting what a lot of people believed in his day. In my notes here, I also talk about another really early, important early church father named Ignatius of Antioch. Antioch is in Syria. He died sometime in the first half of the second century, maybe in the second century, first half of the second century, perhaps the early second century. He knew Polycarp and corresponded directly with Polycarp. So this is another writer, contemporary with Polycarp, writing around the same period of time. Christian authors from the early church period, including Jerome, who wrote later on, said that Ignatius is one of the most prominent writers of the first 4 centuries of Christianity. And many people believe that Ignatius actually had been taught by John the Apostle himself. So a direct eyewitness to the Jesus story and all of that. And John the Apostle himself was supposedly capable of doing miracles as well. That's all part of the New Testament account. So this is a person who would have known whether this story was true, at least part of it. In the early second century, Ignatius wrote a letter to the church in Rome, saying this: "Only pray that I may have power within and without, so that I may not only say it, but also desire it, that I may not only be called a Christian, but also be found one. For if I shall be found so, then can I also be called one, and be faithful then when I am no more visible to the world? Nothing visible is good. For our God, Jesus Christ, being in the Father, is the more plainly visible. The work is not of persuasiveness, but Christianity is a thing of might, whensoever it is hated by the world." So the reason I'm pointing that out is because he's another person talking about fundamental Christian beliefs very early on in ancient history, who's not part of the Bible, who ended up dying for the faith, just like Polycarp, who knew an eyewitness to Jesus. So here we have 2 eyewitnesses, to an apostle. So here we have two eyewitnesses, 2 apostles. Apostles, of course, are eyewitnesses to Jesus, and the apostles supposedly can do miracles. And these people are saying, yes, Jesus is God. They're talking about fundamental beliefs of Christianity. So clearly this is not a later innovation. Clearly this is something that people believed at the time, right around the time these events are occurring, right around the time miraculous things, and just after miraculous things happen, you have writers writing about it. These are converts to Christianity. These are not people who were born into the Christian faith in many cases. These are people who converted to Christianity because they had been convinced by eyewitnesses and eyewitness communities in various parts of the ancient world. In one case, we have Ignatius in Syria, and in another case, we have Polycarp in modern-day Turkey, both meeting apostles, both hearing from other eyewitnesses, both coming to believe the Christian faith. And there are a whole bunch of other sources from the second century that I could also cite. There are people like Clement of Rome, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, the author of the Didache, which is one of the most important early non-biblical Christian writings available. But I think you understand the point here. There are lots of people early on who had access to eyewitnesses, who had access to eyewitness communities, because supposedly thousands of people saw the resurrected Messiah Jesus. Thousands of other people saw Jesus and saw him do miracles. There were eyewitnesses that could attest to these things, stories that had been passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter. Like, these were things that were happening at the time. People who saw apostles who supposedly could do miracles. This was all occurring around the same time. And we have all these eyewitnesses who are willing to die for it, saying, yep, I saw that. Yep, I knew that person. Yes, I believe it. And yes, I'm willing to die in order to continue to say that this thing is true. I'm not going to recount. I'm not going to take it back. I'm not going to say that it's false. I'm going to say it's true all the way up to my death. That's how much I believe it. That's really, really strong historical testimony. You won't find similar things happening when we're talking about people like Alexander the Great or something like that. You're not going to find historical evidence to that degree supporting other historical events. This is unique to Christianity. This is something special about Christianity. And I think it's really important that we keep that in mind and that we understand that. These people lived all over the ancient world. They had every reason to say that this story wasn't true, and yet they said that it was true all the way up into their death. Um, they had access to the apostles. They had access to the New Testament writings. They would have known. They would have had good act. They would have had a reason if they suspected something was off. If they suspected the story wasn't true, why would these people convert to this religion and suffer and die for it? I understand people do that sometimes, but all over the world, thousands and thousands of people, hundreds and hundreds of communities, all doing it at the same time, different religions, religious backgrounds, different languages, different everything. And yet they were coming to believe that these stories were true while meeting people who claim to do miracles. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. I don't know. That just, to me, very, very persuasive. Very, very persuasive. All right, so this leads to number 4. All right, so this is number 4. This is evidence number 4. Evidence number 4 is the early Christian communities were badly persecuted for their beliefs. They had no reason to lie about Jesus, and many church leaders were killed for their faith. Okay, so what I want to do is, because I've harped on this point already, but I really want to hammer this home. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. I could, but I just want to reiterate the fact that anyone can make up a religion. Anyone can say that they saw something when they really didn't see that thing. But how many people are willing to die for that? How many people are willing to be tortured? How many people are willing to put their family members in danger and have their family members tortured and butchered? How many of them are willing to lose their property for their religious idea that they know is not true? How many of them would be willing to do that if they just suspected that it's not true? And yet thousands and thousands of people from the early church period did that thing in communities all over the world, all of whom claimed to know eyewitnesses, apostles who could do miracles, who in some cases saw Jesus himself or had a parent or a grandparent who saw Jesus. They all were willing to die for that. I just don't know how anyone can say that that isn't a really strong piece of evidence that maybe there's some truth to this Christian teaching. Like maybe Christianity actually is true. Again, do we have that kind of thing happening for other events in history that we all just accept as true? You know, no one has any problem believing stories about Caesar being true, Julius Caesar being true, or stories about Alexander the Great, or stories about Catherine in Russia, or whatever. We just accept them as true, even though you don't have people suffering and dying by the thousands in order to proclaim those things to be true. Even when the establishment and the government and everybody is against them, Christianity was a persecuted religion for the first about 300 years or so that it was in existence. It was heavily persecuted by the Roman Empire. People were suffering all over the place, and yet they still believed it. They still taught it. They were willing to die for it. So I want to give you some of the evidence here that talks about this. So according to the evidence that we have, this is a very quick rundown of a lot of the persecutions that were going on in the early church. This is the best evidence we have according to the scholars, and that includes non-Christian scholars. All or nearly all of the apostles were persecuted and killed. So the people who were actual followers of Jesus, actual eyewitnesses of Jesus, who were tasked to go out into the world and preach the gospel, basically all of them were persecuted and killed. Peter was executed in the 1st century, possibly by crucifixion. James, who was supposedly the brother of Jesus, was murdered by Jewish leaders. According to one writer, the scribes and Pharisees placed James upon the pinnacle of the temple and threw down the just man, and they began to stone him, for he was not killed by the fall. And one of them, who was a fuller, took the club with which he beat out cloths and struck the just man on the head. That's the story that we have from the ancient historical records. We have several other early sources that note that Paul, the Apostle Paul, was martyred in Rome in the middle of the 1st century. Bartholomew, the apostle, is believed to have been flayed alive, okay, so tortured and killed alive. He was alive and they flayed him. I mean, ruthless torturing, and ended up dying from that. The apostles aren't the only ones who suffered persecution. I mentioned some of this earlier. Justin Martyr is one of the most educated early Christian authors, not from, if I remember right, not from a Christian family. He converted to Christianity later on. He was beheaded along with 6 others. Ignatius was eaten alive by wild animals in a Roman amphitheater. Ignatius, remember, was believed to be a disciple of the Apostle John. So he would have had access to an eyewitness to Jesus and a person who supposedly could have done miracles himself. So if John couldn't do miracles, that would have been a really good reason for Ignatius to believe, you know what, this whole thing's made up. Also in the 2nd century, 12 North African Christians called the Sicilian martyrs were executed by sword for refusing to swear by the name of the Roman Empire. We could go on and on and on. There are some skeptics who claim that these and many other examples of martyrdom are not true because, or are not likely to be true, because many of the sources for these stories about martyrdom come from Christians. So the argument is that the early Christians wanted to make it look like they were being persecuted, even though they weren't really being persecuted. And I've just got to say, I've always thought this argument is just the most absurd argument that you could possibly make. Even before I was a Christian, I thought this was just a really stupid argument. Obviously, it's not surprising that a group of people who had been badly persecuted are more likely to record that persecution and talk about it than the people who are doing the persecuting or the disinterested neighboring communities. Why would they be talking about these things as much as the people who are actually being persecuted, right? So it's just, I think it's a really bad argument, but you will see people make that argument. It's also, I think, interesting to point out that this is exactly, well, not exactly, but this is pretty close to the argument that's being made today by people who claim that the Nazis didn't actually have the Holocaust. They didn't actually perpetrate the Holocaust against the Jews. So it's like the same kind of thing. How do we know that the Holocaust actually happened? And it's like, well, we've got non-Jewish sources, and then we've got lots of Jewish eyewitness accounts. And a lot of these people say, well, yeah, but you can't trust the Jewish accounts. They were Jewish. That's an absurd thing to say. That's just absolutely absurd. And I think pretty much everybody acknowledges that that's the case. So I don't know why you would apply it to ancient Christians if you're not going to apply it to the Jews today. There are also non-Christian sources who talk about the persecution of Christians. So it's not as though all we have are Christian sources. For example, one of the more notable ones comes from Tacitus. See, he's one of the most prolific historians in the Roman Empire. He describes one particularly egregious persecution in the late 1st or early 2nd century, so very early on in Christian history. It says, to stop the rumor, the Emperor Nero, who had been blamed for initiating massive fires in Rome, that's my note, substituted as culprits and punished in the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator, Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of, that is modern-day Israel, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, meaning Rome, where all things, or Jerusalem probably, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. Actually, he may be talking about Rome there. So this is written by a person who doesn't like Christians, right? It's written by a person who doesn't like Christians talking about how Christians were being persecuted, right? And then in 112 AD, Pliny the Younger, the governor in the Roman Empire of a region that is now part of Turkey, wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan about Christians who had been brought before his official court because they were Christians. In the letter, Pliny admits that the Christians had been peaceful, but that he had been killing them for refusing to recant their views. So he writes this letter saying, if they confess that they were Christians, I ask them again. And the third time, intermixing threatenings with the questions. So again, we're talking about somebody who's persecuting Christians writing this letter. If they persevered in their confession, I ordered them to be executed. For I did not doubt But let their confessions be of any sort whatsoever, this positiveness and inflexible obstinacy deserve to be punished. There have been some of this mad sect whom I took notice of in a particular as Roman citizens, that they might be sent to that city. After some time, as is usual in such examinations, the crime spread itself and many more cases came before me. A libel was sent to me, though without an author, containing many names of persons accused. These denied that they were Christians now or ever had been. They called upon the gods and supplicated to your image. He's talking to the emperor here, supplicated the image of the emperor. He's talking about worshiping the emperor, which I caused to be brought to me for that purpose, with frankincense and wine. They also cursed Christ, none of which things, it is said, can be of those that are ready Christians be compelled to do. So I thought fit to let them go. Others of them that were named in this libel said they were Christians, but presently denied it again, that indeed they had been Christians, but had ceased to be so some 3 years, some many more. And one there was that said he had not been so a Christian these 20 years. All these worshiped your image and the images of our gods. Notice that the test for whether you were a real Christian or not was worshiping images. These also cursed Christ. However, they assured me that the main of their fault or of their mistake was this, that they were wont on a stated day to meet together before it was light and to sing a hymn to Christ as to a God, alternately, and to oblige themselves by a sacrament or oath not to do anything that was ill, but that they would commit no theft or pilfering or adultery, that they would not break their promises or deny what was deposited to them when it was required back again, after which it was their custom to depart and to meet again at a common but innocent meal, which they had left off upon that edict which I published at your command, and wherein I had forbidden any such conventicles. So there's more that we could say about Pliny's letter and other things. But the point is this. To be a Christian in the 1st and 2nd centuries meant that you were going to be very badly treated. Okay? No one would ever want to put themselves in that kind of situation. No one would ever want their families to have that kind of treatment unless they really believed it. And these aren't people who are believing things that happened 600, 700, 1,000 years later. We're talking about people who believe things that had just happened. Communities that knew eyewitnesses to Jesus. Okay? That's what we're talking about here. So it just doesn't make sense that they would be tortured and butchered and be treated as second-class citizens and be, subjects to inquisitions and horrible things, fed to animals in the Colosseum and just awful, awful things, unless they really believed that this story about Jesus was true. And they were the ones who had access to the best evidence we've ever had about Jesus. So the people who knew the eyewitnesses, the people who knew the apostles who were capable of doing miracles, supposedly, these people so believed that the apostles could do miracles, so believed that the stories about Jesus were true, so believed that they were seeing miracles in their own lives, that they were willing to be fed alive to wild animals and scapegoated by Nero and all these other horrible things. They were willing to do this for hundreds of years. It was hundreds of years before Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. It wasn't until the mid-4th century that happened. So if Christians were getting rich off of their religious ideas or powerful, or if it was like a really in vogue, trendy thing to do amongst the elites of the day, all of these things, by the way, can be said to be true of many other major world religions. I won't get into that. But most other world religions, major world religions with lots of adherents, at least at the very beginning, there were real benefits to becoming a convert to that religion. There were military advantages, there were social advantages, there were cultural advantages, there were monetary advantages in many cases. It was a popular thing to do amongst elites, not in the case of Christianity. This is a religion of persecuted people whose main religious figure is a persecuted, executed person. That's what we're talking about. So you got to ask yourself, would all these people believe these things who knew eyewitnesses or who were themselves eyewitnesses? Would they, if they knew that it was all crap, if they knew it was all BS, if they knew it was all made up, or they even suspected it for a second, would they be willing to suffer like this? Not just in one community. We're not talking about one tiny, small group of crazy people. We're talking about people all over the world, thousands and thousands and thousands of them. Would they all have believed this simultaneously at the same? Would they have done that? And I would argue that that's not a very strong. I just have a hard time believing that that would be the case. That people would be willing to suffer that much for something that they knew wasn't true. Okay. Let's move on here. Some people might say that yes, people believed that this was true, but they were just the victims of con artists. Okay, they're just the victims of con artists. So were people just tricked? Were they tricked by the apostles? Were the apostles just magicians, who were able to fool people into believing this whole thing about Jesus being true, and they were able to write these really elaborate documents and things, but they just made the whole thing up. But you have to ask yourself, if the apostles were con artists, what did they get out of it? Like everybody else involved, they were being persecuted. They were executed for their beliefs. Even if they weren't executed for their beliefs, there's no evidence that they got any benefits out of making all this stuff up, supposedly. If the apostles were just a bunch of crazy people and they didn't actually, they really did believe these things, but they're just insane, why did so many thousands of people in the early church era believe them? Why did they believe them? Were they all crazy too? So we're just supposed to believe all these thousands of people are crazy? Is it really more believable that the apostles and the thousands of other early witnesses were lunatics? Is that more believable than to just accept that maybe they were telling the truth? So for many people, the answer to that question is yes. Anything is more believable than thinking that Jesus is who he claimed to be. And who hundreds of millions of people since then, if not billions of people who have claimed to be, right? Billions of people or hundreds of millions of people have been Christians over the course of history, perhaps even billions. And a lot of people look at that and say, yeah, those people are all crazy. But if you reject Christianity, you are also rejecting the rules of normal historical analysis. And you have to accept that. By any modern scientific standard used to determine what happened in the ancient world, Christianity is true. The only reason people refuse to accept Christian teachings while claiming a whole bunch of other things, a whole bunch of other historical events and things like that, with equal or less evidence from the ancient period are verifiable, they believe that stuff is true. The only reason that they're able to hold that intention and say Christianity is garbage, but these things, that's true, is because Christianity is a religion that makes supernatural claims. And so anything that is supernatural must automatically not be true. It must be false. So no matter where the historical evidence takes these people, these skeptics, they reject Christianity because it is religious. They reject Jesus not because there's a lack of evidence historically, but because they don't think the evidence could be true. It's not even possible for them. Or put another way, they think Jesus isn't God because they think Jesus couldn't be God. It's not possible, no matter what evidence is provided, no matter what historical proof you offer. There's a lot of people who fall into that category. So, what do we do about that? What do we do about that? I understand why people would be more skeptical of supernatural claims. That makes sense. That makes sense, right? A higher truth claim requires more evidence. But if you're not willing to accept that any supernatural claim could be true under virtually any circumstances, no matter what evidence I provided you, why are you watching this video? Right? Why are you watching this? Why are you interested in it? Why do you care? You have essentially said, I don't care what evidence you provide me. I can't show you video footage from 2,000 years ago before video cameras were invented, right? And even if I could, you could say that was just made up. It's CGI. It's Hollywood. You have to be open to the possibility for something to be true in order to really evaluate it fairly. Some people say that they could believe something is supernatural, a supernatural claim is true by providing evidence that's supernatural, a miracle. But I'm really not sure that that would do it. There are many people that claim to have experienced miracles, and skeptics reject those people. So what I want to do for the final point is I want to do something a little bit different. I want to talk about the historical evidence for a truly miraculous series of events. And unlike other miracles, these events cannot be denied by anyone. They are absolutely true. They're undoubtedly true. It's just that not everyone thinks of them as miracles, even though I think that's the most rational explanation for their occurrence. Okay, so number 5, this is the final point that I want to make. We've already established there's lots of evidence that Christianity is an ancient religion, that thousands and thousands of people believed it, that they were willing to die for it, that non-Christians acknowledged in the historical record that there were people who believed this thing. We've got lots of evidence, eyewitness accounts, people who knew eyewitnesses, people who knew people that supposedly could do miraculous things. We've got all kinds of amazing evidence that we don't have for anything else in the ancient record. All right? But do we have a miracle? Well, that brings the point number 5 is the modern church is miraculous. The existence of it, the history of Christianity. Christianity is basically the most popular religion in the world. It's hard to say exactly, of course, but it seems as though, based on modern scholarship, Christianity is the most popular religion in the world. The very fact that Christianity is a popular religion and has been a popular religion for a very long time is a miracle. Now, at first, you might look at that and roll your eyes and say, oh, okay, some miracle. No, it is. It really is. And here's why. Just think about this. Christianity was founded by a bunch of people who were uneducated, living in the outermost reach of the most powerful empire in the world. They were hated by the emperor. The emperor. They were hated by the governor of Judea. They were hated by the religious leaders within Judaism, their own religion. They were hated by all these people. They were outcast to society. Their leader, who they claimed to be a Messiah, was yet another person who claimed to be a Messiah in a long list of supposed Jewish messiahs. And all those messiahs had been killed too. Or at least I think they all had been killed. Lots of people had claimed to be the Messiah and they were killed. If you were standing at the cross watching Jesus get executed, you would never think that this religion would be the religion that would become the most popular one in the world. It wasn't even popular in Judea. And Judea wasn't popular in the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire, although it was massive, did not reach every corner of the world. How is it possible that Christianity was able to go from being a persecuted small minority group to becoming the most powerful, successful religion in the entire history of the world? And unlike other religions where you had empires conquering in order to spread the religion in the earliest days, I understand there were Christian empires that came later on and stuff like that. But early in Christianity, they didn't have military, they didn't have money, they didn't have pull from the empire, they didn't have the religious establishment on their side, they didn't have anything in the early days of Christianity. That stuff came later. And they not only survived a period of time where they were being brutally massacred and flayed alive and fed to wild animals in the Colosseum, they became the most powerful religion in the world. The very same empire that executed Jesus became a Christian empire within just a couple of centuries of executing the leader of that religion. That is miraculous. All without a shot being fired, all without anyone being, no military takeover. No rival empire storming the palace in Rome and forcing people to become Christian. No, just by persuasion and miracles. And every step of the way, the only way you can explain something like this happening, because there's miracles being reported all throughout this period, all the way to Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity, which led the Roman Empire to become a Christian empire eventually. All the way up to that point, we have miracles. Constantine himself claimed to have had miracles that led him to Christianity. He didn't have to do that, but he claimed that he did. And the only way to explain all of this, all the persecuting, all the survival, the spreading of Christianity that happened rapidly in an environment where it just didn't make any sense that people would become Christians. Most of the most successful, powerful people were polytheists. They believe in multiple gods. They weren't even Jews. This is a tiny minority Jewish sect converting people all over the world almost instantaneously, and then becoming so powerful that it becomes the most powerful religion in the world that consumes the Roman Empire. That is a miracle. That is a miracle. You can say it isn't, but if it's not a miracle, then the earliest Christians were the luckiest group of people that has ever existed on the face of the planet. They rolled their dice on a false religion that looked like it had no chance of surviving. Their leader had been executed. All of the leaders who were chosen as successors were executed. They were being persecuted. And yet, despite all that persecution, all the executions, the blood in the streets, the empire hating them, they still somehow lucked their way into becoming the most prominent religion in the world. If you don't think that's a miracle, then again, you I just don't know how. I don't know how. And then on top of that, millions and millions and millions and millions of people claiming that they've experienced miraculous events. You can write that off by saying, well, every religion claims that they have that. Sure, but do they have the other things too? Do they have the miracles plus the track record, the unlikely nature of Christianity being successful, the long historical record, the 5,000 early copies of Christian documents in the New Testament? Do they have the non-Christian sources, the equivalent to that, talking about do they have all of that combined? Do they have the fact that they don't have any personal gain involved in any of this? Can you find a religion that's been as successful as Christianity with the same kind of situation? With the same kinds of problems, the same mountains to climb? No. No, you can't, because there's never been one. There's never been one that has had that track record. It's the only one. And the more that I read about that track record and what the early Christians went through to maintain that faith for hundreds of years while being persecuted, the more miraculous it became, the more obvious it became that it was a miracle that the Roman Empire became a Christian empire. The more obvious it became that this was a religion that shouldn't exist as a popular religion, and yet it does. And for me, I think that's the biggest piece of evidence. There's so much more that I wish I could tell you about, so many pieces of evidence that I've discovered over the years. And perhaps someday I'll have that opportunity. But until then, I hope that this video, which now I've got to wrap up, we're way over an hour. I hope this video will inspire you to, at the very least, start looking into some of the historical evidences. Read the skeptics, read the believers, read the best biblical scholars, the best historical scholars. Come to your own conclusion. Don't take my word for it. Do your own homework. But take this seriously. Think about it. It matters. We're not talking about trivial things. if God really does exist and Jesus really is the Messiah, and in order to be part of God's people, you need to have faith in Jesus, then this is an important question. It's the most important question. I hope at the very least this inspires you to start thinking about that question. And if you're already a believer, to talk to other people about it, because it really is the most important thing that you can do in your life. Money, power, success, fame, family, all these things fade away. But if Christianity is real, faith is forever. God is forever. And it is the most important thing. More important than anything else. We as a society, we as a world, we need to start treating it like that. Even if you don't believe, even if you never believe, at least take the inquiry, the questioning, the evidence seriously before dismissing it. Thank you for watching this video. Truly, 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 I am so grateful that you watched it. I will be praying for you, whoever you are, wherever you are. Whether you're in America or somewhere else around the world, I'll be praying for you. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you have things that you want to say or discuss, just get off your chest. Even if you just want to yell at me, that's fine. Leave a comment. Please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. It's going to help more people see it. And if you're interested in more videos like this and you're interested in the other things that I do, current events and other stuff like that, you can subscribe to the channel. I don't make really any money off of this at all. In fact, it costs me a lot of money to do this. I do it because I care. And I hope that came through on this video. So thank you so much. Take care. Until next time, stay free. And of course, God bless.